Diolch yn fawr iawn a noswaith dda bawb. Good evening and thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Emma. My thanks too to the Political Studies Association for the enormous honour and tremendous privilege of delivering your prestigious annual lecture for 2022. I suspect some of you will know that I'm recently back from the World Cup in Qatar. A far too early homecoming for Wales, of course, and commiserations to England too. Of course, when I originally discussed this lecture with colleagues at the PSA, the title and its timing, little did we know what lay ahead in Qatar, although we might conceivably have predicted some of it. There have been plenty of highlights from this World Cup, and quite a few low moments too. In fact, I was tempted to wear my now infamous Wales rainbow bucket hat to give this lecture, but I promise I'll return to that later in my talk. It's become a truism that sport is the most important of the least important things in life. Sport remains gloriously tribal, exhaustingly emotional, and bitterly partisan. At a professional level, sports moved from the local and the national to the inter and supranational. In its wash, globalization has brought plenty of challenges and risks, along with some considerable opportunities. Now, it may sound a touch trite, but in the absence of better vehicles, sport remains an incredible platform for understanding each other better and potentially even for changing social and political relationships. Just in these past few weeks, we've seen American basketball star Brittany Griner swapped in a prisoner exchange, having been held in detention in Russia for nearly a year. We've seen FIFA officials march into our national team's hotels on match day and threaten our captains with, and I quote, a yellow card and more should they wear the One Love armband as intended. Free speech and protest has become contested territory, as we witnessed when a national team refused to sing its anthem at the biggest event they will likely ever take part in. There are surely few now who would still make the increasingly ludicrous claim that sport and politics should be kept apart. The two are intricately entwined, and properly acknowledging that fact might just be our best hope for change. Who knows, sport might even serve as an exemplar for behaviour in public life more generally. Indeed, I would go further. Continuing to claim that politics has no role in sport is a recipe for corruption, as it further distances sport from the standards to which the rest of us are subject. Whilst definitions of both are essentially contested, the reality is there's more synergy between sport and politics than between salt and pepper or fish and chips. Of course, politics is so much more than just institutions and how we're governed. Contemporary definitions of politics go far beyond Laswell's who gets what, when, how resource allocation approach of nearly a century ago now. But at root, of course, it has to be about the exercise and distribution of power. Whilst it's important to theorise and conceptualise, ultimately politics is about power. It's about control, rules, and their exercise. And that too is the basis of sport, whether grassroots or performance. Now, some would say that sport has filled the space left by religion, which in itself is a very big claim, but it does have some traction. Sport, participation and fandom has never been bigger or more expensive or more lucrative if you're on the supply side of the equation. So it's worth a reminder of organised sport's social origins. The martial arts were invented to promote discipline and social order. It's said that cricket was a mechanism to control the lower classes. And athletic sports, of course, have their origins in the ancient Olympics, which were designed to promote the legitimacy of the state. Debate over whether politics is an art or a science replicates some of those surrounding elite or high-performance sport too. The technicalisation of elite sport and a win-at-all-costs approach has led us down some very dark paths. State-sponsored doping, exclusive models of sports governance that have stunted girls' and women's participation and allowed a blind eye to be turned to blatant racism, and the unrivaled pursuit of medals, based on a much celebrated but profoundly problematic no compromise mantra, pushed, by the way, by a government-funded agency, inadvertently has created the conditions for systemic child abuse in gymnastics. Now, I understand that for many citizens, sport is a leisure pursuit, a pleasure, an escape, an opportunity for reaffirming our identity, personal and national, for some positivity and celebration, matters which are in short supply in the political arena and indeed in life in general right now. Sporting accomplishments, it's said, should always transcend the bitter gloom of political argument. But the truth is, sport has always been imbued with contradictions. It's a force for good, yet its own authorities close down debates and eschew legitimate protest. Sport is an enabler and a progressive lever for improved health, for well-being, for equality, and for social cohesion. Yet at the same time, its governance often resembles a medieval court, overwhelmingly white and male-dominated, inevitably prone to blinkered governance, leaving itself open to failing to see or to act upon the most heinous crimes, abuse of a sexual, physical, and mental nature, and often of its most vulnerable athletes. It is inarguably hypocritical to claim lofty moral values and good ethics for sport when we see corporates like McDonald's and Budweiser on the one hand touting pride-themed products, whilst aggressively and actively associating with a World Cup in a state where homosexuality is illegal. We can draw up a long list of athletes who've used their status to raise these opinions. Lewis Hamilton has spoken up about climate change, about LGBT rights and Black Lives Matter. Muhammad Ali on racism, Serena Williams on pregnancy and mothers' rights in elite sport, Nicole Cook on a sexism deeply and culturally embedded in British cycling, by the way, speaking out way ahead of her time, gymnast Simone Biles on her mental health. The canny athletes acknowledge that they live not in isolation, not in a rarefied bubble, but rather as part of society with a fundamental stake in it. Their status as athletes gives them a platform, often more powerful, impactful, and far-reaching than that of elected politicians. And to whom are people more likely to listen? Transport Secretary Stephen Barclay or Ben Stokes? Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting or Harry Kane? And there was only ever going to be one winner in Marcus Rashford's penalty shootout with Boris Johnson over free meals for pupils in the school holidays. Now, this raises an interesting issue about the balance of influence and power in sport too, between athletes and their representative federations. Parallels can be drawn between, on the one hand, individual MPs or MSs and their independent convictions, and on the other, whips and the party apparatus. While some brave athletes speak out, meanwhile, their governing bodies are complicit in countries exhibiting fundamentally different values to themselves. For example, the Formula One Grand Prix in Bahrain, British cycling sponsorship deal with Shell, the hosting of the heavyweight fight between Anthony Joshua and Alexander Usyk in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, a country which earlier this year executed more than 80 men in one day, some for holding dissident beliefs. These incidents tell us everything about the new sporting geopolitics, as well as the dominant currency of modern professional sport. I should talk about Qatar. What else? The biggest single sporting mega event rolled into the tiny Gulf state 3.5 weeks ago, and it will pack up after the final this Sunday. Now, it's tempting to say that the World Cup circus is populated by more conjurers and clowns than ever before. I don't need to remind you that this World Cup has been mired in controversy ever since the oil-rich constitutional emirate won the bid 12 years ago. This unleashed a tidal wave of ethical, moral, and geopolitical tensions. not just amongst the 31 countries who qualified, some of us after a 64-year wait, remember, but many beyond. Yet, as FIFA had always hoped, a good tournament on the pitch, some top quality matches with some nice surprise packages along the way, has at least partially distracted attention away from the swathe of negativity around Qatar, and especially its record on human and workers' rights. Stripping away lots else, I guess one might wish to make the case for spreading the wealth and profile of mega events outside the prosperous European and North American bidders. But as former US World Cup winning goalkeeper Brianna Scurry said, when you choose the country, you choose the consequences. The problem here is that no one is owning the consequences of a World Cup in Qatar. It's an entirely fair question as to what Qatar will actually get from hosting the World Cup in 2022. The oil and gas mega-rich state hardly needs more hard cash, does it? Typically, we'd refer to the concept of sports washing here. That concept has been around a long while, since US sprinter Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, a wonderful repudiation of Hitler's vainglorious attempt to demonstrate Aryan supremacy. But I think we need to get under the skin of the easy label of sports washing. Look at the Qataris' behaviour before and during this tournament, especially when, just 24 hours before it started, they scuppered Budweiser's £60 million contract with FIFA to sell its beer at the match stadia. Hardly an act of good diplomacy by anyone's standards. So what was the hosting really about? Was it about establishing Qatar on the global stage in readiness for once its carbon supplies run out? Creating something of a reputation as more than simply a transit hub? Like other new political epicenters in China, by the way, the last host of an Olympics, or Russia, the last World Cup host before Qatar, was it about positioning itself as the ultimate luxury sporting tourism destination? Never mind your soft power, this is proper hard power. As Barney Ronay said in The Guardian, Qatar doesn't need to be liked, it just needs to be visible. It was awarded the World Cup, of course, mired in accusations of corruption and bribes, but that matters not a jot to Qatar. And it's a matter of scale, of course, but consistency is important, and there are plenty of political reasons to also criticise the so-called democracies of the next World Cup hosts, USA, Canada, and Mexico, for human rights violations, for corruption, for conspiracy, for heavy-handed policing and racial inequality. And it's not as if we in the UK have clean hands in this matter either. Gradual but powerful globalisation of sport has meant a clash between tradition, local history and identity on the one hand, and wealth, investment and purchasing power on the other. So Newcastle United is now owned by Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud, Premier League champions Manchester City by Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan, a member of Abu Dhabi's royal family, by the way, whilst Kylian Mbappe's Paris Saint-Germain is owned by the state-run sovereign wealth fund in Qatar. And it's not just football either. Look at the Saudis' full-throated attempt to split the PGA Tour in golf by picking off some of its stars with a hefty £750 million bribe. And the NBA in the US with its increasingly close financial ties with China. Who would have known that sport was so, well, political? PSA's Sport and Politics Special Group members, evidently. So in the remainder of this lecture, I'll try to develop those interlinked themes around power, equality, representation, identity, and international diplomacy. I think this will help reinforce sport's deep-rootedness and the breadth of its influence and impact across the whole of our academic discipline. I got back yesterday from Nyon in Switzerland, headquarters of UEFA, the richest and most powerful of the 6 football federations that sit under the FIFA banner. As we sat there and discussed the growth of the women's game, a game which now has 1.9 million players in Europe, by the way, that's growing 5 times faster than the men's game, where the recent Women's Euro in England attracted record attendances, including 87,000 for the Wembley final, a record, by the way, for the women and men's Euro attendances. Witnessing this progress takes me back to my childhood as a football-mad girl growing up in Bridgend, spending half of my school week in my stag in the Llinvi Valley with my grandparents, which allowed my sister and I to attend the only Welsh language unit, not even a school, in our area. I loved all sport, and despite the protestations of my netball and hockey teachers in school, I wanted to play football, and play I did, with my brother, my male cousins, and anyone out on the streets who fancied a game. Because I could play, no one took any notice of my sex, until, that is, I got to 11 years of age and was told in a rather brutal manner that the local football clubs catered for boys only. I can remember that sense of incredulity that boys, often not even as good a player as me, would have the benefit of a smooth, well-manicured grass pitch, properly sponsored kit, and some decent coaches, whilst I was unceremoniously cast aside. It was an important life lesson, and one that many women joining this lecture will also have experienced in their careers, be it in education, business, the arts, or politics. In our UEFA strategy discussions yesterday, we discussed recent survey research that showed 77% of the general population described women who play football as strong. As a teenager growing up in South Wales, I was called a lot of things, but strong wasn't one of them. A similarly bumpy and potholed career path for girls and women across sport and politics alike, it seems. Now, I've always been a fan too. I went to my first football games as a toddler with my football-mad grandfather from my stag. I recall away trips supporting Cardiff City with my grandpa, and when he died, I went along with his old friend Billy Bowen, who was no relation to us, but to whose care a 7-year-old was entrusted every other week. I had no idea where we were going on the Cardiff City supporters coach, but the size of my lunchbox that my mum had packed indicated whether it was Carlisle or Swansea. Equally, my season tickets at Cardiff City are bookended, first by a time when the mostly unpopular owner of the club at that time, Tony Clemo, was a local travel agent, to now, when I take my own girls, and the universally unpopular owner of the club is a billionaire Malaysian businessman, Vincent Tan. I think it shows just how far football has come and how much further it has to go. Supporters of sport are its lifeblood, yet still have wholly insufficient agency in the clubs and the sports that they fund, perhaps much like the general public in political decision-making. And as COVID showed, without a live audience, sport is dramatically diminished. Here in Wales, we've seen an alternative culture develop around the Red Wall, our organised fan base, which positions us perfectly for the unofficial ambassadorial role that Cymru's supporters played out in Qatar. We talk a lot about athletes as ambassadors in tracksuits, but the fans are even more powerful ambassadors, in this case in their retro shirts and bucket hats. A recent British Council report on sports diplomacy, authored by Gavin Price and Stuart Murray, championed a more strategic approach to using the power of sport for wider social and political gains. But it's about far more than that. The relaxed bilingualism promoted by the FAW, the adoption of David Iwan's political protest song, Yma o Hyd, Still Here, as our official second anthem, the rainbow bucket hats, the political inquisitiveness of our fans, especially around Welsh independence. Now, no one's suggesting that there's some kind of fans revolution going on here, but football is fast becoming the site for some of the most interesting conversations around identity, the Welsh language, and the political and constitutional future of our nation, some of the things that our Independent Commission on the Constitution is debating currently. And talking to other fans at the World Cup, that's being replicated elsewhere in the world too. Plenty's been written about sport and national identity. Benedict Anderson's analysis of nations as imagined communities sums up sport perfectly, as a vehicle for the imagination and emotions seen through a national lens. In this reading, all nations are social constructs manufactured by media and the government. Competitive sport embodies territorial loyalty and the tribalism of the local, regional, and the national. Perhaps that's why the rather unfashionable Commonwealth Games are still so significant for Scotland and Wales, and considerably less so for England. This strikes right at the heart of my own academic research around politics, national identity, and constitutional choices. My colleagues, Professors Richard Wynne-Jones and Ailsa Henderson, have eruditely exposed the contemporary conundrum of Englishness and Britishness, discussing the sense of grievance around England's relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom and the particularist visions held by some of England's and Britain's past. All of this, of course, was heightened and exposed during and since the Brexit referendum in 2016. And one more thing while I'm on the subject, there is a reason why a Team GB football team at the Olympics riles the Welsh and Scottish fans so much. It's quite simple. Sport, and especially football, is one of the few areas where our nations are fully independent or sovereign. Indeed, we continue to have disproportionate power in IFAB, the International Football Association Board, as the guardians of the laws of the game, as a consequence of our historic roles in founding football. Unless Scotland and Wales do become properly independent in a political sense, Team GB disturbs the delicate historic power balance we share within UEFA and FIFA, and regardless of assurances, could threaten our enduring status as an independent football nation. Whilst out in Switzerland this week, I heard nothing but praise for our fans from my UEFA colleagues, alongside a real affection for our anthem and the way it's sung, for our flag and for the cultural activities that we arranged in Qatar. This awareness of Wales is absolutely critical for the economic and especially the trade activities of a small nation like ours. At least in football, it's no longer the case of "for Wales see England," and credit should be given to our government here for recognising a gift horse when it is staring them in the face. I believe there's a duty on politicians and governments to work with us in sport for mutual gains. Now, that doesn't mean just professing love of taekwondo or track cycling when they're delivering medals. The shiny baubles of elite success can't be achieved without proper, sustained investment in the grassroots of sport. Let me return to my personal story for a moment. I did eventually have the opportunity to play structured football, first with Millwall while studying at LSE, and then when I returned home to Wales with Cardiff City Ladies FC. My political background, or at least my instinctive bolshiness and a recognition that we all have some degree of agency, inspired a group of us to lobby the Football Association of Wales to establish an official women's national team. Now, every one of my 24 caps for Wales means the world to me, but what gives me even greater pleasure is seeing the growth of the women and girls game here in Wales, across the UK and beyond. There is much, much more to be done, but we've made huge strides forward. And without women exerting their agency and raising their voices, we'd still be on the sidelines watching less talented male players booting the ball. As I said recently, women's sport has always been box office, it's just that it's been men selling the tickets. Again, I hesitate to make grandiose claims, but without the women pioneers who organised and fundraised to establish their own national teams, whilst banned, yes, banned by our own FAs for half a decade, there would be no current boom in the women's game. So yes, let's call these legends our football suffragettes and be done with it. If I had £1 for every time someone said the gender battle in sport has been won, I'd be booking a luxury private jet back to the Middle East for the World Cup final this Sunday. Look, we're told, an all-female team of officials for the first time refereeing men's World Cup matches in Qatar. And Alex Scott even presents Football Focus. But dig a bit deeper. There are still only 3 female presidents of the 55 UEFA nations, and that's a 3-fold increase on this time last year. There are no female managers at anything approaching the top level of men's football. Women's sport is underfunded and poorly remunerated compared to lesser quality men's sport, a fact that mirrors the arguments for equal pay in other sectors, of course. The argument that the battle is won as a consequence of increased female visibility draws upon what I've always regarded as a rather peculiar conceptualization of a meritocracy, largely used by those who oppose gender quotas as a form of positive action in electoral politics. The problem with all of that is that with overwhelmingly male-dominated perspectives, the appreciation and weighting of merit is itself slanted and value-laden. I'm also fascinated by the way that the active engagement and campaigning zeal of women in and of sport often replicates the sense of duty that many women in and of politics have often displayed. In our writing on women championing equality in our political institutions, my colleagues like Fiona Mackay, Paul Cheney, Deanna Sturbu, Sarah Childs and Rosie Campbell often refer to women as equality champions or feminist guardians. And a similar concept is playing out in modern sport around us. Emerging is a very differently weighted notion of influence and agency between women and men especially. Take footballers like our own Jess Fishlock, or USA's Megan Rapinoe, or Denmark's Pernille Herder. They've actively embraced the responsibility of representation and voice, talking openly about their sexuality and the role model status that comes with that, but also engaging with debates on poverty, racism and war. In Qatar, we discussed whether our women's national teams would have continued to wear the One Love armband in the face of FIFA's bullying. That we felt pretty confident that they would tells a story in itself. Applied to politicians, it rather underlines why we require more diverse parliaments, executives and officials. Global brands like Visa, Adidas and Pepsi-Cola tell us they favour the conviction values of women sports stars for their newest multi-million-dollar sponsorship deals. Of course, it would be ridiculous to suggest that all female politicians are conviction politicians or that no male athletes care about wider social ills. But diversity can give confidence and variety and help create a virtuous circle in sport as well as in politics. But in this quest for social change, are we expecting too much from our athletes and from those who run sport? And conversely, too little from our politicians, who seem to love the glitzy feel-good victories, but continue to underfund community sport, where our Gareth Bales, our Jude Bellinghams, and our Sophie Ingalls start their journey. Ultimately, it is our own national governments and the progressive alliances built between them that has the influence to create change. Last year, I stood in an election, my first election for almost 3 decades, for a place on FIFA, the world governing body of football's council. A single place for a woman reserved in a paltry and begrudging act of positive action for a seat around the most powerful decision-making table. Now, no one gave me a cat in hell's chance of victory. I was standing against a powerful representative of a political and footballing dynasty. My opponent was the incumbent, which counts for a lot in the weird and wonderful world of sport politics, benefiting from the open sponsorship of the omnipresent Italian industrial magnates, the Agnelli family, who run Fiat, Ferrari, and until recently, Juventus FC. My opponent was the anti-football candidate, with little knowledge or indeed any tangible interest in the game. Some even called her an anti-equality and an anti-modernisation candidate. Now, like election candidates who are told they must fight a hopeless seat, a bit perhaps like Boris Johnson when he contested Clwyd South in 1997, I was told I couldn't expect to win. Nevertheless, like most election candidates, one gets swept up in the campaign. Here was I, a girl from Bridgend, denied an opportunity to play the sport I love, representing a small nation that hadn't qualified for a men's World Cup for 63 years and never for a major women's tournament, up against the creme de la creme of world football. The outcome? Not the win we wanted, I'm afraid, but I did come within 6 votes of unseating my Italian opponent, gaining 22 of the 55 votes up for grabs. That she cold-shouldered me afterwards and refused to shake hands told us everything about how close we'd run them. I mention this not to seek your praise or indeed your sympathy. I lost the election at the end of the day. Instead, it's to show that there is a chink of light in sport around improvement and progress, and to suggest that in some ways, modernisation might come faster in sport than it will in politics. So is it too fanciful to imagine that sport could become a testbed for better values and standards for public life? After the Owen Paterson scandal, the Sunak government still balks at tighter restrictions on gifts to MPs from lobbyists, whilst the Prime Minister has so far failed to find a candidate to act as a new independent advisor on ministerial interests. Whilst MPs at Westminster refuse to accept tighter standards and the arguments for a fairer electoral system that would respect the votes cast in our democracy in relation to the members elected, there is a reform zeitgeist in sport. It centres around redistributing power in the governance of sport based on the mistakes of the past and aligns it with quotas for improved equality and fairer representation in decision-making. It also has as a driver stronger ethical standards. Now, some of this is about elimination of fundamental historic misdemeanours, athlete doping, for example. That's the illegal use of performance-enhancing drugs to you and I. Systematic doping has been in sport for forever. It's just been done by different agents for different reasons. Boosting the profile of a state under communist regimes, the prestige of winning medals in international competitions like the Olympics that are seen by the whole world, personal wealth and aggrandizement, straightforward abuse even. One former Chinese Olympic doctor turned whistleblower has claimed that more than 10,000 athletes were doping and that all of China's medals in major tournaments in the 80s and 90s came from using performance-enhancing drugs. Dr. Grigory Rodchenkov also blew the whistle on Russia's state-run doping program, one he had himself facilitated. Before it invaded Ukraine, Russia was already banned from many international competitions for doping violations. Now, I'm conscious that I said I'd talk about my rainbow bucket hat. I still have it, by the way, and I wore it to each of Wales's group games at the Ahmad bin Ali Stadium. Why? Well, believe me, in the 70-odd interviews I've done, from CNN to BBC World to Al Jazeera since that incident, I've been asked that question quite a few times. Does it not show a lack of respect for the laws and customs of the host nation? That strikes me as a rather ludicrous question in so many different ways. Most of us who went to the World Cup as fans or in our professional roles would admit that we felt horribly compromised there. And let's be honest, we all went for a range of reasons, all of which are understandable, even if some are more compelling and easily justified than others. Our struggles for real equality continue in the West, but in Iran, the repression of basic rights and freedoms for women, and even the right to protest, is literally a matter of life and death. That's why it was so powerful and affirming to see so many Iranian fans wearing T-shirts with the slogans of the movement for women, life and freedom, many of those bearing the name of Mahsa Amini. For those fans, being at the World Cup, even in a country seen as hugely repressive, marked an opportunity for freedom of expression linked to the protest movement at home, but with an estimated 5 billion eyes trained worldwide. But back to the question. Fundamentally, we must remember that this was the FIFA World Cup in Qatar, not the Qatar World Cup, and that is far more than a matter of semantics. FIFA selects the host nations, and until we embed a much stronger code and better entrenched expectations around the rights and respect for all citizens, FIFA's slogans on LGBT equality, that the whole world is welcome to the tournament, sound shockingly hollow. FIFA can paint its Zurich headquarters rainbow-coloured for the whole of Pride Month, but it shamefully failed in one of its most fundamental duties to protect fans' rights, in this case to wear the clothing of their choice into the World Cup stadia. Only those with their own agendas would suggest that any of us thought we might be able to change Qatari culture or laws on migrant workers or on any other basic human rights. Rather, the actions of Wales fans and others in Qatar were about something intrinsically more modest. They were about being ourselves, demonstrating to the world our values and principles, and stimulating the conversations about them with anyone prepared to engage. Thus, our rainbow bucket hats were symbols of our commitment to inclusion and equality, no more and no less, but for that very reason, vital to keep them proudly on our heads. These might appear small or insignificant matters, but big political resistance often starts with small gestures. I'm certainly not claiming parity with any of these, of course, but look at Rosa Parks' act of simple, determined resistance on the Alabama bus, or Tommy Smith and John Carlos, the printers who raised their gloved fists on the medal podium at the 1968 Mexico Olympics to protest at racial inequality in the United States. And you can see them on the poster behind me. Sporting protests should continue and, in my view, be encouraged. Yet, as we discussed earlier, there will continue to be consequences too, lest we forget the IOC suspended and banned those brave gloved medalists behind me, and I'm not sure my public criticism of FIFA will facilitate a successful election if I contest it for a second time. So to close, back to Qatar, where else? As well as us having long-established government offices across the Middle East, Qatar submitted a bid to expand its LNG terminal capacity here in Wales, and it did this actually whilst Wales was still at the World Cup. This will provide a lifeline for extra gas imports to compensate for losses from Russia, now understandably isolated from the lucrative European gas markets. The result of this is 25% additional capacity for Qatari brokered gas sales to the UK, money which of course will flow directly back to the Qatari regime. None of this is new, of course. Keir Starmer can make much of his boycott of England's games in Qatar, but in many ways less hypocritical were the actions of his Welsh Labour colleague, our First Minister Mark Drakeford, who attended Wales's first game there and actively engaged in diplomacy drives. Because the harsh truth is that successive governments here have shown little enthusiasm for economic or military sanctions. They visited Qatar and elsewhere on a regular basis, helping to bankroll the economies of the Middle East. Each time we switch on our central heating or our gas cookers, we're increasingly dependent on Qatari gas running through these pipes. And meanwhile, the RAF has a joint Air Force squadron with Qatar, the only joint squadron with anyone since the Second World War. Now, one wrong clearly doesn't justify another. But we should at the very least confront our complicity and our culpability in creating the political conditions for FIFA to award World Cups, not only to Qatar, but to South Africa, Brazil and Russia in the past, and likely Saudi Arabia in the future. A selective approach to boycotts never ends well, nor does a piecemeal sports diplomacy. The most significant choice we face is when to isolate, as in apartheid South Africa, the one undisputedly successful sporting boycott, and when to stay in the room, to coin a phrase, with a clear strategy to influence and to deal. Now that applies beyond sport, of course, but there's no doubt that sport is the most prominent player in this. It may just be the biggest and trickiest moral conundrum in our globalized world, but discuss it we must if we're to find a way forward that cultivates relationships which over time might lead to reform. In the meantime, selective disgust or displays of favouritism in what feels like some weird reverse beauty contest amongst tyrannical, discriminatory and often brutal regimes is not a good look. We political scientists are instinctively hesitant to draw too many lessons from single events, but perhaps we should see Qatar as the latest in a sequence. Perhaps our learning should be to end once and for all the nonsense of sporting political neutrality and reject the anachronistic protestations of essentially conflicted sports leaders that politics has no place in sport. In fact, I would argue the opposite, that there should be more politics in sport and conversely, more of the genuine values of sport in how our political world operates. That might stop our governments being let off the hook time and time again, as they are currently. And away from the grand slogans and exaggerated claims of both politicians and sporting leaders, we might actually find a way forward, one that allows us to use the popularity, appeal, and reach of sport to truly change the world for the better. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you.